Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Integrate Yourself. I'm Allison Pillow and you're listening to episode 47. Hey everybody, we're in for a real treat today. We're going to be talking again to Kyle Mamounis. We talked to him a while back, I think it was episode 31 on misconceptions of estrogen. We learned so much from that episode that I felt like I really wanted to have him back on and talk about some things that we actually didn't get to talk about last time, and more had to do with the scientific community, how it works, how research really gets out into the world, and some of our I guess we're unveiling some of the truth around that and how things get published, as well as how that conventional health truth gets put out there, and how it gets to be somewhat wrong in some ways, and sometimes it's not the truth. And the reason is, and what we found out today with Kyle is because a lot of details are overlooked, which was really eye-opening. And so this can be a big part of why people are so confused about health, is because a lot of the health recommendations are based on some of this information that actually isn't really true. And so that's what we talk about today, and give you guys some insight on that whole thing, as well as he's going to give us some insight on the educational system and why he says school sucks and what we could do to improve it in the future. So without further ado, I'm just going to get right into it today because it's a really long show. This is actually one of our longest shows as of yet, and I debated whether to actually break this up into 2 shows, but I felt like for the conversation to flow like it does, and for you to really get a good experience of that, I felt it would be better to keep it as one show. All of our shows in the future are not going to be this long, but Kyle had just really some great information. So if you're listening and you need to take a break, no worries. Make sure you come back to it because it is really great information. So without further ado, here's the show. Welcome, everybody, to the Integrate Yourself podcast. We're your host, Allison Pillow and Maya Gottlieb. You can find me, Allison, on pureenergypdx.com, and you can find Maya at mayagottlieb.com. Today, we're here with Kyle Mamounis, and he's back for a second time on our show. He decided to come back, so we're very grateful for that. Yeah, we really appreciate you coming back on our show. And,
No
I feel like we got a good response from the last time you were on the show. It really helped people. I felt like it helped a lot of people get clear on estrogen and what that really is, and kind of our misunderstanding around it, and how we use it in our culture and our society, in the pharmaceutical industry. Check out Kyle's episode that we did with him, episode 31, Misconceptions of Estrogen. It was a really great show. But since we've already had him on, I'm going to just have him tell everybody a little bit about himself and what he does and his background. Real quick intro, and then we are going to get on with the subject matter today, which is, Maya, you want to fill everybody in?
Well, we're talking about critical thinking and why school sucks.
Ah, nice. Okay, great. All right, Kyle, welcome to our show. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. Well, I studied nutrition in graduate school, and going to graduate school dovetailed with my transition from a very low carb paleo diet to reading Ray Peat and drinking orange juice and things like that. So those are really related to me. In graduate school, it was very helpful to have something to read that was outside of the ideas that I was being presented, and things slowly started to make sense, in the sense, like, at first I was like, oh, this thing sounds wacky about, say, like the sodium potassium pump. But Ray was like pro cholesterol. And since I was coming from the paleo world, I was like, oh yeah, pro cholesterol, like cholesterol is good. It's not bad, like everybody's saying, which is still what people are saying in universities, by the way.
Wow.
It's
That's
very
incredible.
strange. And specifically saturated fat more than the cholesterol, but they're both still looked down upon. And then I just kept reading about things and asking questions and noticing that the people that like taught classes or even had labs that were about a particular topic, they couldn't, like say they would be on like if they were on a podcast and it was 3 hours long and they had to talk about their topic, there's no way they could do it because,
right.
They have like, there's all of these closed doors about their story, about their topic. So if you ask them, oh, and then why, and then go, oh, that's not really my area, or no, it just is this way. And to the point where it starts to feel like, so do you know anything? Like, how do you know that, this is real at all? So I was able to survive graduate school without getting what Ray calls the authoritarian, I guess, thing, which I think is a little, I understand what he means by that. It's kind of like when he uses gene theory. I think I would use different words, but anyway.
What words would you use instead to, like, if you could bit?
I think when he says gene theory and like computerizable information, like in that herbal doctor interview that you sent me, he means discrete versus, or digital versus analog.
Okay. Yeah.
Like, because he's never really gone into this, but sometimes one almost gets the impression that he like doesn't believe genes are important. Which, and I think a lot of people that read his stuff get that impression, and they'll say that. And I think that his language is directed at the textbooks and how they speak of genes deterministically. So if you were to put his language in that context, it would make sense. But for somebody that hasn't read those textbooks, they would get a different idea. And I think that that's kind of a problem.
Yeah.
A lot of people get offended by it. They get very upset.
They get offended?
Yeah, because they have this conversation about like, well, it's because my parents had it. I have this issue. Genes are kind of in that state of like, well, that was given to me from my parents almost, and then it's an excuse for maybe not looking to see what kind of contributions you've created in your environment to either turn on and off your genes, which is, like you said, a lot of people don't understand the textbook information, so they don't really understand that can be influenced. So epigenetics, right?
Right. So yeah, when Ray talks about the gene theory, it's like he's talking about the like 1920, like before DNA was even like discovered. Well, the double helix was discovered. So I think it confuses a lot of people, because what has happened, and this ties back into what I've noticed with science, is so the original gene theory, like the neo-Darwinian theory, which would be, they would say something like you could starve a woman when she's pregnant as long as her pregnancy is taken to term and she gives birth. The genes will determine, what'll happen to that baby. They'll achieve a certain, assuming they are not starved like completely to death, they'll achieve whatever health outcomes they're supposed to achieve. And then they slowly modified it over time, rather than just saying, okay, that was wrong. They go, oh, well, and then they came out with things like the recommended daily allowance of, to prevent gross, malnutrition. And then it became, okay, as long as you achieve these basic minimal levels of all of the nutrients, then you'll achieve your genetic potential, which is like fairly rigid. And then it became, there's different times in pregnancy when the different organs are being developed. Like that's the Barker hypothesis of in utero programming. And, if a woman is, particularly stressed or ill or doesn't have good access to food at different times in pregnancy, it'll give the fetus when they grow up a greater chance of having this or that disease. And then the whole epigenetics thing came out, and now there's like microRNA and like all kinds of like really cutting edge molecular stuff that people are talking about. So there's been all these like really small adjustments rather than just saying that the original idea was wrong and starting from scratch. They just keep adding things on. And it's easy to see why they would do that. But what's happening is that the idea about genes and genetics is coming more in line with like what the things that Ray says anyway. So what like a modern person would learn about the gene theory in the textbook isn't really what he's criticizing the same way as I think like when he was younger, the way people were talking about it.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
So do you think
it makes a lot of sense.
As he's progressed in his older years and he's become a little more, I guess mature in knowing that, certain types of information is hard for people to take in. What do you notice the most about what he's saying now? Like, do you have any kind of, about his process? Like you said, he takes information from a textbook, but then he basically has a different approach to it now.
To me, Ray seems like he's been pretty consistent since he started being interviewed. I have read some books, and that can be kind of weird because he used to have different ideas about nutrition. But yeah, I think he says things, I don't know how to put it into words, but I don't think he's comfortable saying something like making a positive statement, but he'll make a negative statement like, oh, this doesn't, like estrogen isn't what they say it is or something like that. But he very rarely says like this like causes this completely or anything like that. So
no definitives, you mean?
Yeah. It's a specific style of speaking. I almost feel like it'd be good if people were made aware of that, before they just start listening to him. Because if you listen to him the way you listen to other people, just, you'll get not what he's trying to say.
Do you think he's more of like also kind of a storyteller in a way, the way he talks about nutrition? Because I feel like he ties a lot of his information in with stories and history and that kind of background,
Yeah, definitely. Although that's what scientists do too. I mean, that's what when you're writing a manuscript, they say, oh, you have to tell a story.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And what
it
they
helps
mean
people
is,
remember. Yeah.
Well, I think it improves readability, but the story that they're referring to would be like, here was our idea, here's what we plan to do, here's how we did it. It's like a boring story. The point is to try to make it interesting with like an elegant experimental idea, like, oh, and then we thought of this, and then have like an interesting results and stuff like that and present them in a story.
So what do you think about critical thinking? Like, let's maybe give your definition of what critical thinking is and why you think it's important and what it really means to you in terms of like reading science papers, deciphering what you're reading and stuff like that.
I do not have a definition for critical thinking.
Okay.
To me, it's just, who was it that said about pornography? They were like, it when you see it.
I remember that, but I can't think of who said
it.
Yeah.
I think it was actually a politician, and they were talking about like banning this or that. And people are like, oh, well, how can you, define? Yeah. Because if you're talking about banning something, you can't really just be willy-nilly about the definitions of the categories. And somebody at some point said, when you see it. And that's how I feel about critical thinking.
So I've read a semi-definition. It's called free-minded, or maybe alternate thinking, as opposed to what you would learn while you're in a certain area of time and space. So So education would give you a certain thing to think about, like, okay, this is how to come at solving a problem, right? And they give you instructions, and then, you know, you're reading that one way of doing it. But then as you find that there are other ways of maybe reading or actually taking apart something and saying, okay, well, let's see if we could put it together in a different direction, that critical thinking is part of that way of learning how to do it your way, I guess, or adapt to it. Would that be kind of something that you would agree with, definition-wise?
Yeah, I guess so. But sometimes I feel like, you know, I don't think people should try to be contrarian just for the sake of being contrarian, you know? Like some people are like, oh, I'm just a free thinker. Like, don't tell me what to do. And then they make like really bad decisions in their life. And then they're like,
just
what?
Because they're rebelling on everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's like a kind of pick your battles, or like, you know, some people say they can like, they have like a BS detector. Like there's certain areas where you, like when something is being explained to you, some of the things that should kind of be like, oh wait, like why was this explained a certain way, but not everything, you know? Because if you just, actually one of my favorite intellectuals, Henri Poincaré, he was a French mathematician, around the time of Einstein, actually. A lot of people think that he discovered the general theory of relativity, but he just didn't think it was that important. But he said that something like to be skeptical of everything and to believe everything is are both equally wrong, or something like that.
I can see that. That actually makes sense. Yeah.
They dispense with the need for internal reflection or something like that.
Yeah, I kept bringing this up, but I love the word discernment. Like, critical thinking makes me think of discernment. Back to the idea of discernment, right? You kind of put yourself in a place of learning how to, find your own way within the pattern that was already there. So you find patterns in all of everything we do, right? It's the certain part of life that you have. And then discernment is to know whether or not I'm going to cross the street and know if that car is going to be 5 minutes or 2 seconds away from me, right? It's that part of you that knows how to make a decision and be okay with that decision.
Right.
So I'm asking, in terms of what we're talking about, is critical thinking a little bit like that in your opinion, or are you guys having a totally different way of thinking of critical thinking?
Yeah. But like, you know, taking the external information that you're being given and like constantly weighing that against your sort of internal like judgment machine and setting course, and, you know, making sure that there's not some kind of really weird incongruency between those two things.
Sure. So, I mean, we're looking at it in the similar situations. So I wanted to know how you do this with your science. Like you have a background in science, and you actually were talking about your papers. So I was wondering if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah.
Tell us what your passion is, Kyle.
Yeah. So I have a few anecdotes actually about this kind of thing.
Okay.
Recently, so I'm a biochemist now, and I had a couple of episodes. So I was not trained as a biochemist in graduate school. I was more of what you would call a molecular biologist. And they use different techniques, different instruments and stuff. And so the point is, I got this postdoc in biochemistry and kind of had to learn on the job in a way where, like, I was the person that knew the least amount of what we were doing, right? When it would be like me, and there was this other postdoc and another scientist that worked in the lab, and then the head of the lab and a lab tech and everybody else. And there were a couple of times, and one that I remember specifically, we were performing this experiment, And it was, so most of what we do are spectrophotometry readings, which is a machine that looks at things change color, basically, over time. So if you have an enzyme that has a color to it, or it acts on substances that have colors to them, and the color will change or go away as the reaction takes place, then you can measure the reaction. You can measure its rate in different conditions, like change the pH and see if it speeds it up or slows it down and all that kind of stuff.
So let me ask you a question before you move on. What would that application be in the real life? Like, if you took what you do, where does it help? What does it give people? Because for me, it just reminds me of a science project that I had to learn, and then I totally didn't know why I was learning it. So, like, could you give an application of why that's important to know?
Yeah. So one of the enzyme that I'm working on now is a glycine oxidase. So it oxidizes glycine, and I know that there are lysine oxidases. So enzymes usually from a bacteria that are studied and isolated that oxidize lysine specifically, the amino acid lysine. Mm-hmm. And sometimes those are used, for example, in the food industry. They would have kind of like a glucometer for blood glucose, but instead of measuring glucose, it'll measure free lysine with a lysine oxidase, because that's how those meters work anyway, is they oxidize the glucometers. The testing strip has an enzyme on it that oxidizes glucose. And when it does that, it pulls electrons off of the glucose and creates a current, and the meter measures that current. So it's actually like a multimeter, like an electric meter. And so you can do the same thing with an amino acid testing instrument and test like if fish is going bad, because apparently lysine increases a lot in fish as it, like, even before you can smell it. That's just one random.
It's pretty useful.
And it's useful because if you can get something that is specific to that one amino acid, you know.
Oh yeah.
So and that works in the room temperature and the pH of fish.
You're helping the fish in the world, the fishermen to know when their fish stink. I got it.
Yeah, even before. It has predictive fish stink power.
There you go. No more for the nose. We just look at, lysine.
But a lot of this stuff doesn't really have practical applications. But so this particular enzyme, we have this one instrument that measures the color change at milliseconds. So if you have a reaction that happens like instantaneously, such that a lot of spectrophotometers, they can take a reading and then take another one in, say, 1 second, but that's too late. Like, the reaction's already over. And if you want to see how fast it's going, you need a bunch of data points as the reaction is going along. So as the color change is happening, as the reagent is being consumed or whatever. And so for this particular instrument, you have to load up the reagent that, so glycine, right? It's a glycine oxidase. So you've got glycine, which is like every repeat person's favorite amino acid, right? and this glycine oxidizing enzyme, and you put them together in these two plastic syringes and put them in this machine and inject them. And then the machine will push them together really quickly and take a bunch of readings at like millisecond periods to see the color change. And we were getting these crappy, noisy readings. Like, you can kind of see the color change happening, and then there's just a bunch of just noise, just imagine like audio noise, but it's visual, but it looks the same when you're looking at it on a computer. And I was looking at the syringe with the enzyme in it. So it's a yellow enzyme. It's kind of like orangey yellow, this glycine oxidase. And it looked like there was crap in there, like right before we would put it in the machine, like stuff, like as if it was contaminated with something, just like fibers of whatever. And so I was like, is there stuff in here? And everybody's like, no, there's not stuff in there. And we get a fresh batch or whatever. And it took a really long time for me to convince everybody that the solution was like cloudy, like it was there was stuff in there.
Oh wow!
And it ends up that for whatever reason, just the enzyme starts to precipitate in the conditions that we were putting it in, which is that you get these plastic syringes and you have to keep air out of the instrument. So do you guys know what parafilm is? It's like a paraffin wax. Mm-hmm. And you seal a syringe and then you pull the plunger down, which makes a vacuum. Oh. Okay. So now you've got your amount of liquid and then some vacuum. Okay. And then what happens when you have that vacuum is if you flick the liquid, then the dissolved gases in the liquid will start to escape into that vacuum to fill the vacuum. And this helps because those dissolved gases, they can create bubbles sometimes in this machine and can mess it up. So that process called degassing was causing the enzyme to precipitate out, and it would make this noisy signal. And I had never done any of this work before, and I was just looking at it, and it looked cloudy, okay? And it took a long time for everybody else that was used to working with this stuff and doing this technique for me to convince them that there was something as simple as like there's crap in this syringe, it looks cloudy. Right. And that really stuck with me as, I don't know if you'd put that in the realm of critical thinking so much as just when people get specialized, you know, it's like obvious things can be missed. And it takes, like, to be able to hold on to that ability to see like what a normal person would see, but also have the specialized knowledge is pretty rare. It seems like most people give up the former in the attainment of the latter. Right.
Yeah, I agree. That makes sense.
I think what you remind me of is like, like you just said about where somebody has been doing something for so long and then they don't have the critical eye, so they don't really pay attention to specific like changes, like the details get missed because you've done it so many times, so many over the, you know, it's like then the kind of do it on autopilot, and then autopilot becomes that part of you that doesn't see those little definitive things anymore. So like coming at it as a new beginner is really important because you then keep yourself from being bored, because the part of you that's been doing some pattern for so many times and so long, you find that you don't like what you do anymore because it's not exciting, or you've done too, you know, it's just the newness has worn off.
Yeah. I guess that's where creative thinking comes in, where you just have to stimulate your creative side by doing other things and maybe looking at it from a different perspective, you know, if you want to keep doing that work. But like if you're always, I guess, doing the same thing over and over again, staying in kind of with your blinders on and not going outside that box, I can see how that would happen. And that you know, it happens a lot, I think, in general with most people, because we're doing the same thing every day and, you know, going the same path, we're driving to the same place, we're doing the same things. It's a pattern, which, you know, some habits are healthy to have, but I think, you know, too much of that can be unhealthy and can even like just squash your creativity and critical ability to critically think altogether. So that's a great example, Kyle. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. You're welcome. The scientific world. Yeah. So I can see, so I guess that would translate into like how a lot of people in the scientific world and educational system maybe would lose that ability to critically think, even though we kind of have an idea that they are doing that. But maybe since what do you think about that? What is your opinion on how people are thinking in the scientific community right now? Are they critically thinking? Are they on their creative side enough or not?
No. So the problem, as I see it, is one that it can be like the analogy of natural selection. So, you know, like if you look at, you know, any kind of animal, you know, the reason why it is the way it is because being that way, you know, got it to survive there, you know. And if the conditions were different, then you'd get a different animal. So you can't raise, you know, say like a brood, a pack of lion, whatever. You could say you had a bunch of lions and you had like a lion farm for, thousands of years, and you just fed them and they didn't have to hunt, and you didn't, they always survived and reproduced, right? There was no selection. You probably wouldn't have lions that have the same qualities, as the lions that we know, right? And it's sad that some lions die as cubs, and it's sad that all that stuff is sad, but that's why the lion and all the other animals are swift and all that. So what gets selected for in our school system, like from the earliest level, and then perhaps even more intensely, like in science and research science, is definitely not critical thinking at all. Like, it's the ability to fill out a lot of paperwork correctly and to like submit it to some higher authority for, a degree or permission to do something or grant money. Convincing bureaucrats that your project is a good project, not convincing regular people, not convincing, like the researcher in diabetes doesn't have to convince patients with diabetes that their research is valuable. They have to convince persons on the committee for the National Institutes of Health, the digestive and whatever the NIDDK is, they all have these big acronyms for the different funding sources. Anyway, so it's not surprising at all that what you get is, people that they conform to the structures that they're selected in. So they're good at certain things, they're not good at other certain things. And, they quickly get like defensive about all that kind of stuff. I mean, people never talk about, like the website Retraction Watch.
Retraction Watch? Is that what you said?
Oh, you've never heard of that?
I feel like I have heard of it, but I can't remember what it is right now. Yeah.
It's when papers are retracted for like being, fraudulent or having some sort of major mistake or something like that. But it's kind of like, okay, so, like the idea of the police, how it's like they serve you.
Yeah.
That idea. Yeah, I mean, I kind of like tread lightly when I talk about the police, because like it's very, it's just very difficult. But
yeah.
So if it was true that the police were willing to sacrifice themselves for the people, and that then when there was a bad cop, that was like hurting people, or like maybe a couple of cops that were, instead of just, doing like the whole like cops as drug dealers thing, like things that we know happen,
like Miami Vice.
Yeah. Then all the good cops would immediately rat them out and say, this guy's got it, but they don't do that. It's like an insular protective thing.
Is it really like that, or is that just a Hollywood view of it, do you think? I mean, I sometimes
there's plenty
wondered.
of true stories.
Really? Really?
Absolutely.
I think it's like that more than anybody can. I mean, just that, like that, we're talking about the history. Like, I have a lot to say about the history of school. I mean, the history of the police. I think a lot of police departments started as slave collecting, fugitive slave collection agencies in the South and also in the North because of the Fugitive Slave Act. And they just transitioned into police stations that, serve and protect. Yeah, the history of a lot of the institutions is, and that's not to say that history means that that's what they do now, but it's not that a bunch of people got together and said, okay, we as a community in town X have a problem with crime, and we're going to imbue these certain people with this, law enforcement. That's just like the story that I think everybody thinks like that's what happened, but that's not how any of these things came about.
Right.
Whether or not they do that now.
The Western movies that you used to watch, those are not real. Like that whole, like the sheriff leading the group of people to stop the bad guys and all. Like some of that stuff was not. It was more the other way around, where the the people who had the money who bossed everybody around. And then you basically had that kind of like theories of who was in charge, and you paid them to stop bugging you. So
like the mob.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I don't have any proof to what it's saying.
That's new to me. I didn't know that.
But
yeah.
But there are, like, if you start researching, and you probably know more, Kyle, about like all this, because you know there's different ways of reading history and different ways of like really seeing who was in charge back when, you know.
Right. Yeah. So I would say that insight about the nature of the police, and it's not to say that like they're all bad people or whatever, but it's like if their mission statement was true, then the first thing they would do when there was a bad cop is turn that person in, be like, this person can't be a cop. That's disgusting. We would never do that. You know, we're so sorry that somebody like that came up in our ranks. Like, do I even have to say that's not what they do? Like, it's like, would they ever apologize? You know what I mean? It's like, if I produced, like, if I was, you know, like if I had students or something that I was teaching science, and one of them went on to do something really bad, like fabricate a bunch of data or kill somebody, I would be like, I can't believe that, you know, I can't believe that somebody like that would do that came from my ranks, and I really need to do some soul searching about like what, you know, did I miss something, or is this part, you know, something like that, at which you would expect if you had motives that were true or whatever, like good moral motives about what you're doing. And so I think the same thing is with the scientific establishment. Like they, like we saw it with the climate gate emails, you know, like their biggest concern was, oh no, like this information is getting out, it's going to make people skeptical about global warming. Like their issue
that's already happening.
Well, this is back in like 2007.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
But and you know, it was just like a bunch of emails about people that, oh well, let's like focus on this result that supports what we're saying and not this one, you know. And it's a bunch of kind of like manipulating the data and that kind of stuff. And again, that's not to say that they're all wrong and they're all liars, but none of their reactions were, oh my God, I can't believe this, we would never do this, this person, you know, shouldn't even be able to do science anymore, that's the complete wrong way of thinking. Their reaction was, you know, circle the wagons and kind of be like, this isn't a big deal, there's nothing to see here, you don't understand.
What'd you say, Maya?
The lawyers that come in and tell everyone, you know, nothing to see here, you've got everything, and they, you know, push that whole part of the like, it's not our fault kind of thing away.
Right. Yeah. So, and just that if their motives were to spread truth, then they would be aghast at, you know, people that were talking about manipulating, you know, and they'd be like, oh my God, I can't believe somebody like that came from our field, and this is such an embarrassment, and we need to increase transparency and not decrease transparency of what we do. That would be the response if they were trying to, you know, spread truth rather than some other thing. And so I think you could just look at the whole scientific establishment, you know, medical, it's all very
intertwined. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I was going to say secretive, but it's not even that it's like secretive. It's just kind of this whole combination of like, oh, you wouldn't, yeah. Do you really have to see that? Do you really want to see that paper? I mean, you wouldn't understand it anyway. What's the point? Just listen to what I'm saying. Like, that's kind of the attitude. And it's not the attitude that somebody would have if they wanted to serve you and wanted what's best for you and respected your intelligence, respected you as a person. It's just not how they would act. So I think people should be very aware of that when somebody's telling them something like, does this person respect my intelligence?
Right. Well, why do you think that is? Are they trying to cover lots of things up, or what's your take on that? What's your feeling about it? Or they just don't I don't know, or they just don't feel like explaining it to people? I mean, what's the deal with that?
Well, a lot of things aren't explainable because, I mean, just a random thing like anesthesia, that's not really explainable, like how that works. It like there's not a receptor, for those chemicals, and it's very like,
Right.
I think that's one of the reasons why anesthesiologists make so much money, because it's like it's like an art.
Yeah.
They look at the patient and they're like, okay, like they're this old and this is how big they are, and they have to adjust, because people die from
Yeah,
anesthesia
they have to
all
get
the
it
time.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just okay, what's the patient's height and weight? Or like, oh, we can tell from their blood type that they need this type. It's not scientific like that. It's not understood in that way. And a lot of things are like that, and so they don't want to talk about it. Like that's not. Here's the thing about it's like the taxi cab industry before Uber and Lyft and all that stuff. Like in New York City, you had the medallion, and I think that system started in the Great Depression, and it was because, just like everybody else, taxi cab drivers were having a hard time making ends meet. So they said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to cap the amount of taxi cabs so it'll decrease competition and allow these people to make a higher wage. And so the amount of taxi cab medallions was capped in the 30s, and the population of New York City has increased like exponentially since then. And I think they used to sell these medallions for like $20 back then. And before Uber destroyed the cartel, they were like going for $1 million.
Jeez.
And so but the point is, so there was a cartel. So it was an artificially low amount, and they were protected from competition. So the taxi cab drivers are literally and figuratively in the driver's seat. Like they didn't have to have good customer service. They didn't have to pick up people, the whole thing like, oh, won't pick up like a black guy in a bad part, like, because they don't have to, because there's more customers than there is suppliers.
Right.
And you can't legally compete with them unless you have the medallion. And the medical industry is exactly the same way. If you don't have, board certification from the American Medical Association, it is a cartel. So they don't have to justify themselves to you, because if you decide I'm opting out of the medical system, there's plenty of people to fill their offices, because they artificially cap the amount of medical students that can come in, the amount of medical schools and medical students that can come in every year to keep the competition down.
Ah, okay.
And they say it's because of quality. But if you go back and read decades and decades ago, it was all started with this thing called the Flexner Report, when all these institutions got created, and they were very open about it. They were like, there's too much competition. There's too many doctors. And that's what doctors were saying back then. And you could make a decent living as a doctor back then. And can you imagine that?
No.
The gall of these doctors, like, oh, there's too much
They're
competition.
trying to make ends meet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
well, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's why they don't have to, forced through competition, to have to answer. Like if you had to buy a smartphone from Apple and there was no competition, and you were like, hey, this feature isn't working right for me, can you explain this? Like, I'd be like, no. Like, I don't feel like it. Do you have a problem? What are you going to do?
It's called the post office, or the FDA.
Yeah, the DMV.
DMV, yeah, all of it. It's all based on the same idea of that you think you have freedoms, but you really are controlled by who are more behind the scenes than we realize. Like big guys who say, yeah, let's control the market and keep that up. Now, I know there's words for what we're talking about. What is the main, like, conversation in terms of, like, what does it mean? Like, what is that, strong arm? What is it kind of, there's they talk about it in, I don't know if it's psychology or physiology, philosophy, where the way that you're patterned of how you are instructed. It's not. Do you know what I'm saying? I don't know if you know.
Like a type of teaching, you mean, or a type of?
Yeah, they say it's a pattern of some sort in the construct of like how this kind of gets created.
No, I don't. I would just call it a cartel. I mean, that's literally what it is. We have a medical cartel and an educational cartel.
I think I've heard it been described that way as well. It's I would agree that that's pretty much what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, that's literally what it is.
Yeah. Oh,
Like
yeah.
like factual, like the definition of the word is what this is.
Right. Okay.
All right. So, what would you say about science and how to read science papers, though? Because some of this is really showing up to be a problem. If we know that they're got the cartel mentality and they can say what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and then you go on to Google, maybe you go to PubMed, you start reading about science papers, and you realize, wow, I really do not know what to believe. This is saying this, abstract saying this, and one abstract is saying that. What would you say is the best way for people to kind of apply critical thinking to that?
Yeah, that's really tough because there's more papers than you could ever read anyway. So you end up reading something and, who knows who wrote it and all that stuff. But like I said, I did have examples, and they're actually very similar to the little anecdote I told about the protein coming out of solution and being cloudy. In that sometimes there's simple things that you could find that just obliterate the entire paper, and then you know that there's no reason to read it, or you can change your perspective on it. So my dissertation was about different types of fatty acids and obesity, and I was coming at it from the perspective that I was very skeptical about, saturated fat causes obesity, that statement. So there were some papers that I found. One is called Saturated Fatty Acids Produce in, it's really long titles, I'm sorry. Saturated fatty acids produce an inflammatory response predominantly through the activation of TLR4 signaling in hypothalamus, implications for the pathogenesis of obesity. Okay, and this thing has like 20 authors. Yeah, and that's the whole paper. No, that's the title. Yeah. There's another one too. So I'm making the same point with both of these papers. And the other one's called Toll-like receptor 4 mediates vascular inflammation and insulin resistance in diet-induced obesity. So they're both about kind of the same thing. There's this receptor called TLR4, Toll-like receptor 4. We'll just use receptor as the term right now, the operating term. But it's thought to respond to bacterial infection. So it's very sensitive to endotoxin. And there's this idea that saturated fatty acids partially activate the receptor as well, kind of like how so-called environmental estrogens can have partial activation of the so-called estrogen receptor. So a lot of receptors, which is why I don't believe in receptors, because they all receive information from like dozens or hundreds of things, right, rather than what their ligand is. So at that point, it's like we need a different word, but so both of these sound pretty technical, right? And if you look at what they actually do, so most people, when they read a paper, they go to the results, okay, where there's like graphs and stuff. I don't know if you can see this, but
yes,
stuff like that. And so I would say, I don't know, off the top of my head here, maybe I would break 2 or 3 levels of scientific criticism. So one of the first levels, the simple one, something that a grad student would do, is sometimes they would criticize the statistics that are being used, because these things will always have error bars, or sometimes they'll say, oh, this is a representative gel, and representative means this is the one that looks the best out of all the ones that we did. Like they're kind of playing that off as like, oh, this is how it always looks when we do this assay. But of course, which the one they're going to publish, right? So occasionally you'll go and you'll see, they'll say what their statistical test that they did to create the different significances of the treatments and the different results. And you can go, oh, why did they use that one? Or, something like that. So, but that to me is kind of boring. So I like to go to the methods, okay? Because you don't have to know anything to, not saying that people, not making a judgment on people knowing things or not knowing things. But so this one paper, so it's basically saying that saturated fat activates this TLR4, toll-like receptor 4 thing, and causes inflammation. And that is a source of the metabolic inflammation that people talk about with like type 2 diabetes and that whole spectrum of like metabolic syndrome, the things that cause like heart disease and all of those associated comorbidities. And in their supplementary materials, supplementary information, they have their full method. So they didn't have enough space to have it in the main publication. So online they have their supplementary, and it tells you what kind of mice they had. So they actually had transgenic mice, a bunch of complicated things. But then when you get to the diet, they said that they fed these mice either a low-fat diet, and then in parentheses it says 10% saturated fat.
So they didn't even really do it.
Wow. Yeah, so you got to look at the details there.
Well, that's not the worst part. Or high fat. And in parentheses, it says 60% saturated fat that were otherwise matched for calories and micronutrients. Now, what's weird about that? Do you notice anything weird about that description?
The part of the 60% or the 10%?
So it says low fat, in parentheses, 10% saturated fat, or high fat, in parentheses, 60% saturated fat. There's something really weird about that, about saying it that way.
Well, it doesn't make sense to what I can't understand it. Like in my mind, like it's like a math problem. I don't understand if it like accumulates to 100 or if it's basically
right.
Like, how much fat is it then? I don't get it.
Right. So the problem is that they're saying it's low fat, and then they're reporting supposedly the saturated fat contents. So they're not even really saying what this fat, like, so normally you would say we used a low fat diet and 10 or 15 or whatever percent of the calories came from fat. And then after that you would say, and here's the breakdown of the fat. It was 40% monounsaturated, blah, blah, blah.
They only gave the saturated. Yeah.
Exactly. And they did the same thing for the high fat. They said 60% saturated fat, which is crazy. I mean, if something is 60% saturated fat, then it's like 100% fat because you still have to account for the monounsaturated and the polyunsaturated. Yeah. So unless it's something like coconut oil, it's nearly 100% saturated fat, you've still got a lot of fat left over to account for from a dietary fat if it's 60% of your calories. And so that at the end it says research diets, which is it's actually a scientific diet manufacturing company that was right around the corner from from Rutgers, where I did grad school. I went there. That's where we bought our diets from, which is important because I used these diets and I know what they are. Numbers D12492 and D12450B. I use those exact diets, and they're not 10% saturated fat or 60% saturated fat, respectively. They're 10% fat and 60% fat.
That's a big difference. Yeah.
Right. So
detail there.
Right. So the point is, and actually the fat source is mostly lard. So they have a ton of linoleic acid in there, a little bit of monounsaturated fat. They're pretty balanced between PUFA, MUFA, and saturated fat. Mm-hmm. So all this technical analysis that they did, and then they say, oh, look, it was caused by saturated fat. They literally just wrote saturated fat. It's like they read the label and it said 60% of calories from fat and put the word saturated in there.
Right.
And it wasn't. So.
This is so awesome because.
Yeah.
You know that thing I just sent you about that workshop thing? So
Yes.
I put the stuff about saturated fat, and I just found this article from somebody else who wrote about the diet heart hypothesis and why it is actually based on assumptions and observational data on animal studies. But it really, what they did was they took saturated fat raises cholesterol, right? So the idea of that was A causes B, and the cholesterol causes heart disease, and B causes C, then that means saturated fat causes heart disease, which is A causes C. And the whole idea is the hypothesis was based only on assumptions. So this hypothesis. Thank you.
Hypotenuse.
Whatever. This idea was turned into public policy in 1977 before it was proven to be true. So everything that you've ever read about saturated fat causing heart disease is wrong because it wasn't based on evidence that linked it to it. It was an assumption to it. And then what I found through this other part of the article, which links back to what you're talking about now, is that saturated fats was, the idea of LDL and the cholesterol being the bad cholesterol. And no one talks about this, but the idea that LDL actually has two different types of LDLs, and the ones that they have found some issues with is the small LDLs, right? The small LDLs basically are the lipoproteins that penetrate the arterial wall, and that causes the heart disease, right?
And that comes from starchy carbohydrates, correct?
Right. But the saturated fats actually are large and big, and they don't penetrate. Well, saturated fats actually convert small LDLs to large LDLs. So basically, if you take out your saturated fat, you have no part of that particle to be changed over to the larger density ones. So back to what Kyle is saying in terms of the research, he's like they just dropped in and said, hey, we want to make saturated fat the bad one, right? Put everything that's bad saturated. Cool.
Do you think it's that for that reason, or do you think it's just out of just ignorance in a way? I don't. Do you think that they just didn't maybe know?
If we talk about cartels, we got a vegetable oil system that is a big cartel based on how much they try to feed animals to get them a higher.
That's right.
They get higher yield, so they would feed them these oils to induce fat, so they would build up. Mm-hmm. So that's another cartel to sell you something that supposedly is good for your heart, right? But makes you fat.
Well, they stopped putting it in paint, and they decided to give it to people and animals.
Mm-hmm. Well,
thought that would be more lucrative.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean and going back to what I think Kyle is talking about is, and Kyle, you can definitely jump in. I just wanted to kind of bring that up because it's really a part of the issue about when you're reading something, if you don't understand that the description of something, like, it totally made it seem so confusing that I didn't even care what it was anymore. Like 6%,
yeah.
10%, who gives a shit? Like, you get so frustrated. You're like, what is this saying? And it's like purposely trying to deceitfully lead someone off into a tangent, right? Because it's only like these key words that get people caught, It's like organic or low fat, or it's these trendy words that can kind of be thrown around, but it's also misleading because you can just say it one way and the whole thing sounds bad, right?
Right. So they have this whole paper with a lot of like technical experimentation that they did, and the results they got could be valid. But then they say, oh, and this is due to this saturated fat that we gave the animals. And it's like, you didn't give them saturated fat. So it doesn't matter. Like, you did all this stuff. And it's almost because they had all these technical things to do. And I don't even remember what they did. Probably a lot of ELISAs.
With causality, like the relationship of cause and effect, like the principle of it is, it can be biased based on how you equate it, so like I just said, like A plus B equals C, but then if you take A and you're kind of bringing this blanket of assumption, and that relationship between something that happens or exists didn't really happen. It just was, I'm going to conclude this.
Yeah. And so I think that, these people, maybe they didn't know anything about nutrition, and they just have this lab and they're like, okay, we're studying this inflammatory response, and maybe they wrote a grant to apply it to nutrition because they thought that would be like an avenue to get money, which it is, and they don't know anything, and then they just call something saturated fat. And then how many people that read this or are in a similar field and are citing it took the time to read the methods and see that these results that they got were not caused by saturated fat. They were caused by, a mixture of different types of fat being fed to these animals. Like nobody.
Yeah.
I would bet, a lot of money that I'm the only one. I know I've done this. I have cited papers just based on the title, because when you're writing in academia, you don't have like you're in a class and you're writing like a mock grant proposal or a paper or even your own dissertation proposal. There's no way that you have the time to read cover to cover the hundreds of articles. It's just, everybody's just lying, it's kind of a wink, wink. Like, it's like if you said, I took an ancient Greek class and I read all of the ancient Greek philosophers. So I read them all. And it's like, there's no way you did that. You can't have done that. Like, maybe you read all of their names, like, like a chronicle, a list. Yeah. So people just say, oh, I read that. And it's like, maybe they read the results, like they read the abstract just to see that the paper makes sense. Because sometimes people will incorrectly cite a paper. I've seen people do this where the title is mildly ambiguous and they think that it's supporting what they're saying, but it's actually not supporting what they're saying. And so,
right.
Yeah. And so usually
and
the abstract.
It's clear that they didn't read it when they,
Right. Yeah. Very clear.
So they use a lot of correlations, right? Like, I think there's it's correlation versus causation, where you basically take an overall like assumption, or you take basically one event and the occurrence over and over again causes this causal relationship between the two events. And so these kind of thinking is, first, how much work you guys have to do, like as scientists, you're trying to get a grant, you're trying to get people to back your science, you have maybe a true altruism reason for why you want to test this result, but then you have to have money to back you up, then you have to have, the people to do the work. And like you were talking about, when you come in and you find that there's a screw up in the testing, does anybody notice, or they just keep moving on, keep brushing it under the rug, like, oh yeah, no big deal, right? And I just find that seems to be the attitude even in the corporate world, right? You have all these people in charge that are
probably everybody's just energy deficient, like they have no more brain room for anything.
The same conversation comes up when I talk to people who like, how did this person get in charge? And you're like, I don't know.
Yeah. That's a good question. Well, it's pretty disturbing, I have to say, because a lot of ideas and products are based on some of these research studies. And if like the majority of them are, if this is an example of the majority of studies, then wow, that's crazy. Like I can't.
Yeah, and it is. So that was like a major part of one of the sections of a dissertation is the literature review. Mm-hmm. So your job is to kind of summarize like what's been done or what's known about your topic, and then say what you're going to do, to take it one step further. And just about, I mean, some studies are good. They'll say exactly what the breakdown of their diets are, but even when they do that, even when they do a good job, a lot of times, like the other paper I was going to reference, it says that saturated fatty acids do whatever it is they found out happens in their particular study. And let me just refresh myself.
While you're refreshing, can I ask, do you have any names of people that are reputable or companies that you kind of see that people who do some science are fairly credible?
I don't know any companies.
No companies.
There was one of my favorite papers to cite in graduate school was this really big epidemiological study done by a group that was run by a guy named Joe Hibbeln, Hibbeln. And he's actually from the Navy, and he was a psychologist or psychiatrist, one of those two. And he did medical research on depression and omega-3 fatty acids. So he was one of those people that was saying, you know, that people are deficient in omega-3 fatty acids and have too much omega-6. And this is bad for mental health outcomes. And he eventually got his group, he just attracted grad students, I guess, that would, I don't know if he had a lab or what. He was in DC, like with actually working with the National Institutes of Health, but he had this one person, I think Alvheim was the last name, Alvheim. But they did a big study about the consumption of dietary fat from 1909 to 1999, and the difference. And they had this difference in soybean oil consumption went up. I use this over and over again because sugar consumption from that time over the 20th century, it went up like 60% or something, which sounds like a lot. But if you look at like vegetable oil consumption, it went up like 100,000%.
Oh God.
It's like this huge number. It was like an insignificant source of calories at the very beginning of the 20th century. Like people just didn't make, soybean and safflower oil. It wasn't really an industrial product the way that it is now. And of course it is now, and everything like, commercial salad dressings and cookies and potato chips and everything uses those because they're cheaper. And
You're talking about like trans fats when you talk about that, right? Because those are the polyunsaturated vegetable oils that were chemically made to do. Is that
these are just the regular vegetable oils.
Okay.
So when they want to make margarine out of them, so when they make them solid, then they become the trans fats.
Okay.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But just to finish up this paper, they did the same thing. So they had a low fat diet and a high fat diet. And the low fat diet was actually 50% saturated fat. They used different units. They didn't use percent calories. It was 4% of the grams were fat. So since fat's 9 calories per gram, that's probably about 8 to 10% of the calories from fat. Oh wait, no, it'd be less. It would be more than that because fiber, whatever. And then it says in parentheses, 2% of by weight is saturated fat. So 2 of 4 is half. So the low fat diet was half saturated fat and half non-saturated fat. The high fat diet was 36% by weight fat and 5% by weight saturated fat. So 5 of 36 is not half. It's not even a third. It's not even a fifth. Because 5 times 5 is 25. Yeah, it's not much at all.
Right.
And so, of course, what they do is they show that high fat diet has all of these negative outcomes vis-a-vis inflammation through the TLR4 receptor system that they're studying. And what they're really doing is studying a lowish fat diet with a lot of saturated fat versus a high fat diet with a lot of unsaturated fat, and showing that second one is really bad.
That's crazy.
that's not how they report it, of course.
Right.
And it's hard to even call it a mistake in the sense of like,
how can that be? Like
that
doesn't seem.
It's such a basic mistake. It's like it's like just saying, it's like, okay, we're going to study this like blue thing, and everybody looks at it and it's red, and you're just like, hey, let's like study
Let's
how
call it
blue
blue.
this is.
Yeah, well, that's it. The thing is, like, there's so many detailed aspects of it, right? But then that is a huge detail. It's like probably the biggest detail of the whole.
Yeah, you can't get past that.
And
detail.
they got it wrong.
Right, that's the most important part. Like, if you're going to say X causes Y, right? You can show Y all you want, but if you didn't actually apply X to it, then you're done before you even start. You can't go anywhere with that.
Right.
You know, they're actually, even in the epidemiological level, one of the things that I always say, and nobody ever had any response, like at graduate school, but how could saturated fat cause X, Y, and Z? Like whether it's heart disease or the obesity epidemic or any of those things. Throughout the 20th century, when the intake of saturated fat decreased over that time.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't even prove something like what you were saying with correlation and causation. Even if it did increase, that doesn't prove it caused anything.
Right.
But you can kind of think about it like, oh, maybe it did. But if it decreased over the same time, that does prove that it didn't cause it.
Right.
Because something that's not present cannot cause something else.
Yeah.
Like, that's so.
And the American Heart Association is still saying that saturated fat causes heart disease. I can't even believe it. It's just, at this point, it's almost a joke, you know? Like,
Yeah.
But we wish we were laughing. It's really an actual problem, because people are still bombarding themselves with omega-6s, and they're doing fish oils, and they're doing oils. Like, you know, some people have kind of admitted to the fact that, you know, olive oil, but then you got the whole idea of where are you cooking with it? How are you cooking with it? Is it really olive oil, or is it a soy product that's made into olive oil? You know, that kind of like issue comes with, like, you're still causing your low thyroid and your liver dysfunction. So it's kind of not, it's kind of funny and kind of not. You know, we got to kind of get past all this somewhere. But I think with the money flows, that's hard to kind of, like you said, you have so many hurdles to try to disprove these, like, screw ups that they supposedly had, or maybe it's not even a screw up, maybe it's an intentional biasness to keep, you know, saturated fats down and keep using vegetable oils. I mean, if you got the money, you're gonna keep, you know.
Well, there's a lot riding on that.
You're gonna be the cartel, and you're gonna tell everybody how to be, you know, and this is
true.
What you're gonna do.
Well, you know, the same thing is happening now with the sugar thing, the anti-sugar thing.
I noticed.
Can we talk about that a little bit?
Let's talk about it. Yeah.
So Allison was at, you know, my talk in Seattle, and you remember that, right?
Yes.
And one of the big points was that sugar consumption has gone down since the turn of the century, you know, from the 20th to the 21st century. But type 2 diabetes has continued to increase, and that it's not quite as bad as the saturated fat causes heart disease thing, where it's just negative correlation throughout the entire timeline that's relevant. But if sugar, you know, was a primary cause of type 2 diabetes, then it's just really extraordinary that it's like phantom. It's able to cause it even as it's being decreased in consumption, you know, make the rates higher and higher. I think I actually put that like on Facebook, and Denise Minger, like in one of her things, and she was like, I guess we didn't know how bad it was, like making a joke, like it's still, even though sugar is starting to decrease, the intakes of sugar is decreasing, and diabetes is getting worse. It's like, well, I guess it caused more diabetes than we thought. Like, even when it's going away, it's still causing it. Oh. No, well, she was joking.
Yeah. But, okay. Because I was going to say, I'm pretty sure she doesn't believe that. I think I've talked to her about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the problem is then also Alzheimer's and dementia are increasing as this whole idea of sugar is bad.
Right. So the point is, that's like one of these really easy things to grasp that is kind of irrefutable. Like if you have this, if you're hanging your hat on this, like sugar causes this other thing idea, and the sugar consumption goes down and that thing doesn't go down, it doesn't even stay steady, it still continues to increase at a similar rate as it was before, then that is a huge problem. And that's like a theory ending problem. And I emailed to you guys that I'm embroiled in this thing about the extended manuscript for that talk.
Uh-huh.
And so the paleo movement is basically has taken the baton. Somebody actually made this meme of like two racers handing off a baton of bad science, and the racer,
wow.
Yeah, it was like the racer handing the baton was saturated fat causes heart disease, and the one picking up the baton, and the baton said bad science, was sugar causes obesity or diabetes.
And that's exactly what I see happening. It's so crazy. That's a very good, So, well, and then in the argument I've heard is that there's this one thing, it's kind of like, it reminds me a little bit of the China study where, they have this evidence that came out that the sugar industry paid off somebody to be quiet about it, or, I can't remember the details now. I wish I could. Now it just went blank. But have you heard that argument, Kyle, where they paid somebody off, and so now like they're evil?
I mean, people get paid all that's another thing. Like this whole
paid off somebody to stay quiet about some research about sugar, like that. Right. About how it's bad for you.
I'm sure that you could find that somebody got paid, about everything. So like if you want to say, oh, this thing is evil, it's like you could find somebody that got paid to say anything.
Right. and that's the argument I hear over and over again, that same thing. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I get, if you're doing studies where people are only eating sugar and they actually can't handle sugar, they're not able to metabolize it well. I mean, I suspect you'll probably get some studies that are finding that people are, having a hard time with that, and they're not healthy, and they're having a hard time, regulating their blood sugar. Again, it's what context they're using it in, and what kind of people they're studying. Are they studying healthy people, or are they studying people who don't have great metabolisms,
Right. And that's the point. That's the thing that's holding up this manuscript. So, I sent it in, and I got that review back from Feinstein, Richard Feinstein, the not the famous dead physicist, but the like anti-carbohydrate biochemist.
Okay.
No, not Feinstein, Feynman.
Oh, okay.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Feinman. The famous physicist was Feynman. Anyway, so he basically just said this paper's garbage. It needs a rewrite or whatever. He didn't really have any real criticism. So I sent back a pretty nasty email. I was like, this isn't a review. This guy's career is built on, carbohydrates being bad, especially sugar. Why would you have him review the pitch? And then so the guy that runs the journal and the Ancestral Health Symposium, Aaron Blaisdell, he said, okay, I'll get somebody else to do it. And so then he sent a review back a couple weeks later from an anonymous reviewer. So, and it's like, okay, so not that necessarily means anything, but it's just funny. It's almost like he learned from that first thing to just not tell me the name of the person. Because anybody he's going to know is going to be anti-sugar, because everybody in that world is anti-sugar. He can't find some, like, even in mainstream, like it has reached the mainstream now to be anti-sugar. So it would be extraordinarily difficult for me to find somebody to review a paper that is not biased against sugar. But anyway.
Yeah, it is spreading. It's growing, the number of people that believe that. And again, like, it very much reminds me of the saturated fat thing. I mean, I think they're just running with this kind of biased research that isn't really telling the whole story. about.
You know what you could go
Yeah.
is the neurology departments, because neurologists know that the glucose is part of the function of the brain, and how and there is the guys who do explain pain. I don't know how much they do nutrition, but they do know how often the brain is being activated by the nutritional depletions of things. Maybe you could kind of go there.
How about like Zachariah or somebody?
Yeah, I mean, I would go to the doctor, Dr. Cobb. He's he's very much knows much about the repeat theories and stuff, because Zachariah and other people that are doing it, and they basically are going to do like a nutrition with that theory of it, about Ray Peat's work and stuff, and Hans Ehle and other people. But, maybe go into that direction to find someone who could really be less biased to not sugar being a bad.
Oh, I don't need somebody to review it. So I'm pulling the submission from.
Oh, I see.
From Aaron's journal. I don't want to deal with it. But
maybe
it's really.
Maybe if you even just looked at it, maybe you could find some people that were in the same realm of what you're worked on, because your work is important and people need to know it's out there, and we have to have some I don't know, backing to know that people who are doing science like you guys are really out there, because the more that these people who are against sugar keep pushing towards sugar being bad, it's just going to get worse before it gets better. And I'd rather have your work out and someone else's work that is working with you to help us, because we're like, shouting in the wind sometimes, because people are so indoctrinated by their doctors and their cardiologists, their rheumatoids, they're the people that are all against inflammation, and then create this thing about like sugar's bad, and it's like, no, look what's happening to this person. They're becoming more dimensioned. They're having more balance issues. They're having issues with anxiety. They're, falling apart. They're, and people are just like, oh, that's because of my genes.
I'm going to rewrite it for just a regular journal and eventually try and get it published. And more people read it there anyway. Like, nobody reads that Journal of Evolutionary, whatever it's called.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Well, I don't know what, like...
You couldn't even remember the name of it, so that's probably not...
Yeah, I mean, it's fine. It's like, it has a few interesting things in there, but last year's, the issue of the extended abstracts from last year, because after this, I got really, like, frustrated with this process. And because it was basically, he was questioning, he was like, well, you need to have, like, sources for... And it's like, I had all these references in this paper, and I went back and looked at the previous year's issue, and my paper it was like 60 references, and there were papers in there that had like 2 references, 4 references. I mean, some of them weren't saying much at all. They'd just be like a page about how like shoes aren't paleo, or like something really basic like that.
Right.
But still, like, if you compared that to it was just very insulting for him to suggest that like it wasn't like scholarly or something. And then I looked at the downloads, and my paper had like 1,300 downloads or something, and all the other ones are like 100, 200, and I'm like, what? Like, nobody's reading this crap, Aaron. Like, no, like, I'm not famous on the internet, like, I'm not like a Chris Masterjohn type person.
Yeah.
So it's not like these people are just downloading it because, I mean, I don't know why they're downloading it. I guess I like put it on the Ray Peat forum or something, and people that are interested in like this whole.
Give it to us. We'll download it. We'll make a copy of it.
We'll help you.
So the problem is that the same thing. The second reviewer said that I have to put like the other side on the paper, the other side, and this also inspired me to go back and read these other, because that's not their journalistic, like when he has other papers of other topics, it's obvious that he doesn't make them present the other side, right? Like if it's a pro keto. And the argument this person made was there's all of these clinical studies where reducing sugar improved these markers of insulin resistance. And I had said this. First of all, I wrote this in the paper. I think I said it in the talk, and I said it to you guys in the last episode. And it's a very basic point that anybody should be able to understand. If we're to take as evidence of causation that a treatment that improves like the symptoms of something, that thing was causing it, then you have to apply that to everything, right? So if you have these clinical trials where taking a bunch of fat, insulin-resistant patients and cutting sugar out of their diet helps them lose weight and have less, visible markers of insulin resistance, then all the clinical trials where they did that and reduced their fat or gave them some drug or put them on an exercise regimen, you would then have to say, oh, that means that dietary fat causes insulin resistance. Oh, that means a lack of exercise causes insulin resistance. Oh, that means not having taken this drug causes insulin resistance. Like, you can't treatment that has visible improvements of something can't be taken as the cause of why that thing was there in the first place.
Right.
Yeah. And I thought I had made this very clear. Like, you just have to imagine like me getting these emails of these like crappy reviews and just wanting to flip over a table. So the point is, it's sometimes, we think about history like, oh, how did this thing happen where saturated fat, oh, was it these vegetable oil companies, and was it like all this and that? And it could be just like it's happening right now. We are in history is happening, right? It's always happening.
Right.
And if you look around you and you just pull yourself outside of like the zeitgeist, like hive mind for a second, and notice like, do you guys remember the Kony 2012 thing on Facebook? Do you remember that?
Kony 2012?
Yeah, Kony. It was this African warlord. Was his name James Kony?
Why do I all of a sudden feel really old? Like, I don't realize so many things. Like, what have I missed? I mean, I know I took myself.
Well, this is 6 years ago, but yeah, there was this thing on Facebook that like I saw it popping up on everybody's feeds where they were copy and pasting this video, and it was called Invisible Children or something. It was basically, there was this guy in maybe Uganda, whatever, somewhere in Africa. Excuse me. Not that it's not important, but I just don't remember.
Right.
And he was one of these warlords, and he would go around and kidnap like children, and they would be his soldiers, and he had this big children army, and he would like torture people. It's like a really bad guy. And somebody made a documentary about it, and they were like, oh, we need to go in there and stop this. He had been dead. Like his thing was done after that was going around. And it ended up being this thing where, you know how like the American military is kind of always looking for an excuse to like go somewhere. Yeah. At least that's my pet theory about the Kony 2012 thing. But the reason why I bring it up is I was sitting, it was like a Saturday, and it was my first iPhone was the 4S, and I was sitting in bed, and I was like, oh, I love my iPhone. It was like my first smartphone. And I was watching videos and doing all the things you can do on a smartphone. And I went on Facebook, and I saw just this proliferation of all these people on my friends list who are not into politics. Like they don't actually go out and learn about things and then post them, were posting this video. And I just got a weird vibe about it. I could just feel like something's weird about this. And a week goes by, and then everybody forgets about it. And then I started seeing some videos on YouTube of like commentators that I like describing what had happened and how this Kony guy wasn't even relevant anymore, and that it appeared like this was kind of a propaganda effort to maybe get like NATO and American forces to like start to infiltrate into certain areas of Africa or whatever. Still though, the people that posted it, they didn't know anything about it. They just saw this thing. They're like, oh my God, children are dying. Let me just paste this.
Right.
And so it's the same thing with this nutrition stuff. It's happening all the time. And, because people are tribal, and it is very easy for, like people at this point, sugar is bad for you is at the level of like, that's kind of like, oh, I'm woke. I know sugar's bad. Like it's cool. It's cool to think sugar's bad.
It is. Yeah.
And so we're at the beginning of this cycle. Get ready. This is the golden age. We're right at the, like, it still has to get,
It's peak.
like, we still need grandma to buy into it, and then we need some more legislation.
Well,
like, let's tax soda, let's tax apple juice.
The grandmas are starting to buy into it. I have some older clients that, they're already on. I talked to my client today about cheese. Like, she's like, I've been told not to eat dairy and not to eat cheese. She said it, they said it's bad for me. I'm like, no, eat all the cheese you want, go for it. She's like, oh, really? I'm like, yes.
I was recently watching something about where women, there was a nutritionist, is a show about how they looked at people's diets. And this woman, they did this sensationalization about it, where they took the amount of cheese that she ate in a year and then put it on cubes in a bag, and then spilled it all over the floor and made it look like it was this massive, disgusting amount of cheese, and she should be so ashamed that she's had this much cheese in her 1 year of her lifetime.
It's so silly.
And and it's a sensationalization that let me show you how bad you've been eating so much cheese, and it's the same thing. This whole thing is about how can I make it an emotional fear, let me put you under this idea. And I kind of hear what you're saying about this Coney 2012. I think I saw a meme that said something about, I'm sharing this video, I ended the war in Uganda. There was a war, and you're looking at this whole sense, what Facebook is a problem. You are taking something you have no idea, and you're saying, oh my God, I got emotionally abounded to this, so I need to spread the word. And then you spread it, and then people are like, did you check to see if this was real or not? And no one does that. In some now do, because they like to point the finger back at the idiot that put it out there and go, you're an idiot, so there's that part of that. But
it's like reading the title of the scientific article and just
right.
It's just going with it.
Or
so that's why I like that story so much.
Yeah,
because science and all this stuff, it's all just that Coney 2012 phenomenon. That is the driver of the majority of kind of cultural things in general, but even academics like to think that they're better or whatever, but I have seen it. It is not, they're not better. They do the exact same thing. A lot of people would rather be wrong in the majority during the time of their career, because they know that is safer than being correct in the minority. And so they just post Coney 2012.
Well, I was talking, but people are just throwing money to these things. We've talked about these things in cancer, breast cancer, walks and stuff like that, where, you don't know what's going on, but you're emotionally drawn to the idea that you're
right.
someone.
It's the emotional aspect of it. Yeah.
But
that's why people,
as you're saying, it's also it's this. I won't look in the direction of the truth. I know there's a little lie going on, but I'm going to save my butt from having to stand up and say, no, that's not how it really is. And it's sad.
Right. I think that in the science world, people, the way that it happens is, if you are of an inquisitive type, intellectually curious, which not many graduate students are anyway, but if you are, there's a comfort in, you have your, the head of your lab. So it's I don't fully understand what we're doing, or I'm not really satisfied with this explanation, but I don't want to sound stupid. I don't want to ask again. I don't want to question this. So, but there's these people senior to me that are vouching for what we're doing, or the results, or the type of techniques we use, or that this diet is 60% saturated fat, or whatever it is, no matter how ridiculous or how really complicated and minutia it is, but if you are not intellectually satisfied with it, you are comforted by other people, especially people senior to you, reassuring you about it. And then you move up in the process, and you maybe become a postdoc, and then you become an assistant professor and have your own lab, but then you still have a committee to answer to. And by the time you're done all of that, right, and you're like in your 50s and you're a full professor with like a big lab and money, it would be akin to committing suicide for your identity to turn around then. So it's, and I don't even think it's intentional. Like, you could see how it could be intentional. Like if a criminal kidnapped a kid and makes the kid steal a candy bar from the store and then says, hey, I'll turn you in, like people do that when they kidnap children sometimes, and they tell them that they're going to get in trouble or something like that. Yeah. You could see how that's intentional, but I think it's just right. So I think that it's a natural selection. Like, there are these criteria to get money and resources for academic research, and the archetype of a person and the things that they do that best fit that selection criteria is this model where you do something that is interesting to the people that are in the funding organizations, that seems important to them, but it actually has to be in line with the rest of the field, because the people judging these grants are sometimes working scientists or in some way related to the field. And so it's a personal affront to them if, like, your project, I mean, let's just call it like your idea is wrong, the project. Like, who's gonna be okay with that, right? So
right.
Even if you want to do that project, you have to call it, I have a slight addendum to your idea. And before you know it, like, unless you're some kind of devious, like, sort of maniacal genius and you're just going to like pretend to go, I mean, most people just get absorbed into the system, just like how people say about politicians, it's like, oh, they go to Washington, and then it's the same thing with the academic system.
Yeah. And it makes it kind of a sad story, because most of the time the guys like you are the ones that are like questioning small things because it doesn't seem right. You get tired of the monotony of the tribal, okay, we'll just go this way and do that. You just say, screw it, I'm not going to be in this, why am I going to put myself into this department? I'll leave this department. And I think Ray even talked about how he had issues with the biology department versus when he was looking for his era of expertise. He was just like over the top with the frustration of that. So. But that's the problem. We don't get the good guys to stay long enough to outweigh the crap. You guys are way overwhelmed by, but every way you turn, you kind of get, told, okay, that's not done right, or this isn't done right. And
that's why I think it's important to have people, I mean, I don't know what we would call it in our group or tribe or whatever, that support those ideas, especially now. And we have the capacity to get this information out, probably much more than we did, 10 years ago or so. So, like, using these platforms, that's why I think this is another reason why I asked Maya to start this show with me, because I just think it's so important to get this information out. Whether what people do with the information is totally up to them, but I was reading through it and I was like, if I don't talk about this stuff, if I don't get it out, if I don't just start that dialogue, I think it's just not, it will die with Ray Pete, or, I mean, there may be some people, that are still going to keep it going, but I wasn't seeing anything that was really, promoting the ideas in a practical way that people could use them or really understand. So, Kyle, we really appreciate you, and we're glad that you're doing the work you do, and we're really happy to have you on our show anytime you want to come on. Use our show as a platform for yourself to promote yourself and your ideas and whatever projects you have coming up.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. So.
And Allison's a a really badass with the video editing, so she could give you probably a couple of tips that she's learned.
Yeah, I'm happy to share. I don't know if I'm a badass about it, but, but I do my best. Yeah.
Just to have the patience.
I wish I could have some more fancy, like, graphics or whatever, and figure out how to do that. But that takes money.
That's what I want.
Yeah. I mean, my brother-in-law he's a production guy, and he does sound and video and everything. So I could probably get him to help me with some things, but
cool.
And then, I'll pass that on to you, Kyle. And if I find out any secrets, but he's so busy all the time. So I haven't had a chance to pick his brain on that, but he gave us a compliment. He said our show's really good. So I thought that was good coming from a sound and video person.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I thought it was because you didn't say use family.
Well, it might be that too. So it's like 2 hours, 18 minutes. Do we want, I feel like this has been really good. We've gotten some amazing information. Do we want to close it up? Do you want to talk about another topic, or where do we want to go from here?
Well, something I wanted to say earlier is just a little bit about the history of school, because this is fresh in my mind.
Sucks. I was going to say, why does school suck? Yeah.
So there's a lot of pretty good historians on school and where it came from, and a lot of different places that you can hear this story, especially if you go to that podcast. But so there wasn't school, as we know it in most of the 19th century, like the first half of the 19th century in America, and or anywhere really. And it started in Prussia. And how it started was, the Prussian Empire was like a loose federation of Germanic states. And it's kind of hard to imagine. They didn't have nation states the way we have them. Like even in the, like France was not like France, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there were like 20 languages in France. It was like this just a totally different world. And so these empires, such as the Prussian Empire, of course, they would have military campaigns, and they noticed that they were having this problem. They were having several problems because they would just conscript young men, sometimes even boys, from like rural villages. And of course, they were illiterate, but they would speak a different dialect. And worst of all, they were not excited about dying in battle. They would, as soon as they would see the enemy soldiers start to fire or come at them, they would run away. They would like pee themselves and get shot and not even fight. Like they would do all kinds of.
What? They were human?
They would do all kinds of things that are not stereotypical of a good soldier.
Right.
And so the intelligentsia of the Prussian aristocracy and royalty came up with this idea where they would take all the children at a young age and bring them to these places to teach them ostensibly for their own benefit, right? To make them literate and teach them basic information about mathematics and stuff like that, and history, pro government history. And to teach them to, stand in line, and that the government is their leaders, and that they pledge to the flag and all that kind of stuff. And they called this school.
Oh, wow.
And it was effective. People who would work like in a more worker bee like fashion, and would just go along with what the central government told them, and would be better soldiers. And I forget the name of the person. There's this famous person who started school in America. He went to Germany. They also invented the Ph.D. degree.
Oh, wow.
So all of these Americans went over and got these PhDs and came back and said, oh, this is great. We're going to have school. And that is the history of school.
Wow.
And it's gone through a lot of
Doesn't sound
permutations.
like a positive place that it came from, really. Like
Well, some people would
Yeah.
say it's communism or China in the making, like the whole idea of like everyone having to go into the military at a certain age, that makes sense, They still
Yeah.
do that. And France was one of those, like where men had to go to, at least 2 years. I think Israel still does that.
France is starting it again.
Are they?
really.
I just saw that. Somebody
Why?
posted some news article. I mean, I don't know. It's
Well, we can
like the
guess.
whole thing is just like, I don't even care about, like, it's like, whatever, if they want to do that, that's fine. But it's just the idea of school as education being inculcated in people, and kind of like police are security, right? It's like, it would be kind of like your parents lied to you or something, like that kind of emotional thing to like overcome that information that is just simply not true. And to some extent, school does educate people. I mean, like, obviously you could counter and say, well, oh, I learned things at school, but that doesn't mean that that's its purpose. And it certainly wasn't its genesis, to create this education. I mean, in America, it was used against the Catholics at first, because they were like, oh, these, goddamn Catholics, they drink and they do
Right.
all these things that like Anglican, people don't do. And we have to control them. And, the parents, they're damned. They're already going to go to hell, but let's get the children. And it was called Christianize the Catholics.
They did a similar thing to Native Americans.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, all over the world, everybody's in school.
Yeah.
And
Everybody's in
instead of-
school.
now-
School.
And now instead of them being, soldiers, they are now being indebted servants, because now these schools are causing so much debt before you get out of them. You can't do anything except being in the cog in the wheel. You have to pay off your debt, and school loans are now the biggest and the baddest ass way of keeping people controlled, because it's like having a house loan before you even started your first job.
Well, and if
Yeah.
the kids can't pay the loans, then the parents are responsible for them now. Did you know that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Got the whole family covered.
Yeah.
It's always
If
about
they
Yeah.
getting
if
the
they
kids,
co-sign.
right? Like you're talking
Yeah.
about the Kona guy, Coney guy. Military guys, they learn to pick at the kids. Get everybody. That's what they did in Germany for the war. They got the kids to tell on their parents, and so
Oh, right.
the whole idea of like, molding a mind at a young age keeps people, on their toes, because then you kind of have to think about who's watching you, right? A child is watching you all the time.
Right. And also,
We went
like, with
into
this,
a weird place with that.
with this,
That's why I don't have kids.
if you suggest that
Yeah.
school is like a problem, right? Like, people don't hear that. They don't hear. It's the same thing with if you say something about the police, like if you say, I am opposed to school, and then you're going to go on and explain why, but all they hear is, I hate children. I want them to be ignorant and illiterate and die in a ditch or something like that, because it's just how people are. Like,
Right.
if anybody ever says, uses children, again, it just comes back to, they're not respecting your intelligence. They're not respecting you as a person. That's not an argument, to say, like, basically, Nassim Taleb, actually, do you know that guy? Have you ever heard of him?
What
He
was
wrote
the
a-
name? I didn't hear that name.
Nassim Taleb. He wrote
No.
a book called The Black Swan.
Yes.
Oh, Black Swan. Yeah, I know that book.
He was a trader, a financial trader, and then he was a professor for a little bit, and he studies probability. But he's very anti-GMO, and he wrote this really funny thing, and it's only funny because he's like in his 50s and he was a professor and he's like wealthy from his trading activities, but he speaks very plainly, and he said, if I suggest that like GMO isn't a good solution to like some country's problem, because they'll make this argument like, oh, look, we can save all these lives with this like genetically engineered corn that makes vitamin A or something. And if you suggest another solution to that problem, like have just better general nutrition for those people, so they're not getting their vitamin A from like corn or rice or whatever, then they can just call you an asshole, because it's like, what, you want these people to die? Like, like you can't, as long as they have inserted like an emotional issue, then it's this like handle that they can just turn the argument with. And it's very
seems like
strong.
That's going on in a lot right now, in a lot of.
Yeah, someone wrote an article about how the liberals, and I'm not saying like just taking the word, just people who are very proactive in terms of advocacies for what they believe in. So someone who's very liberal to one lean of thought, and they are basically having a harder time having discussions with these people because they take an emotional aspect and put it into the debate instead of just trying to work through the debate in a way of like seeing all angles. Then we kind of go into this, well, you must be against anything that, like you said, against children, right? You don't like children. Or, there's something about like not having that ability to take the emotion out of any kind of discussion. It's always about, how can I make you feel like you're the lowest of the low because you don't agree with me? And it's kind of a hard way of like even getting anything done, because you just you have no real logic to a conversation.
Yeah, and people just shut you off. So there's no perspective sharing or no compassion for the other person, and you don't have to agree with them, but at least you can be open to hearing what they have to say, and that's the nature of a debate, right?
Yeah, I think all this actually is a very healthy development, like the breakdown.
I'd love to hear your opinion on it, because I think
the breakdown of political discourse.
Because right.
I think that there's a lie that has been told for like at least all of my life and probably decades before, which is that politics are in some way based on rationality, and that people can work together in huge groups of hundreds of millions in some kind of cohesive fashion that the human organism in any way can comprehend or interact that way on Earth. That our brains are made for thinking and not for just behaving with extremely simplistic heuristics in like a caveman environment. All of these kind of, because like what you're saying, people will, shut you down or be emotional. Of course, that is their prime directive. Like people are programmed to be afraid, antagonistic, aggressive against minority opinions in their tribe, because you can understand how if somebody's just like, hey man, maybe tigers aren't so bad. I don't know. Like, let's just.
Oh yeah,
like,
that makes sense.
Maybe these snakes aren't poisonous. Like, I mean, whatever. Like, or maybe this mushroom isn't poisonous. Like, I'm just a free thinker. Like, there's in the natural world, in that kind of decision making, and at that scale of number of people, things are much less complex, and the knowledge of like an adult person, it is really extremely valuable, like vis-a-vis survival for a young person. And tribal elders, like there's real stuff there. And but just that's not making that system bigger and more like advanced technology. That is no longer that system at all. Like that, but we still have the same brain. So it's the same brain in this dynamic where it's like we're in a country, if America, any country really, I mean, so many people, completely irrelevant decisions to the apparatus that humans are best at making decisions about. And all the while, what people really have is not like a thinking machine, but sort of like a rationalizing machine. Like, I feel this way. Let me get reasons for why that is correct. And unfortunately, people can convince themselves that they just thought critically or logically through that thing, very, very convincingly.
Well, one of the things that it makes me remember is the neurology and the brain function, and how like low energy is a problem, because the frontal brain is like, I don't know how much energy it takes, but if you think about how it travels through the brain stem and then goes through the whole limbic system and the parietals, then it goes through the frontal, like to get energy to your cognitive thinking, to get to your part of the frontal brain, is you have to have more than just survival amount of energy, right? You have to have enough for this thing to work itself and be open to stuff. So like one of the things about like reducing your energy is that this part of your brain doesn't get what it needs. So your eyes, your vision, your vestibular are all connected to that. And so your survival brain, the part of the brainstem, the first brain, is always your decision maker when you're in low energy. And that part of that means that you will always ignite your limbic system, because it's part of the base of the cerebellum, and parts of where your body and brainstem will always feed itself first, basically, right? Because it has to survive, to keep you from running out into the street, getting run over, making yourself, do stupid things, right? But that's also based on development. So like, I always got told that, it took, I think 25 years or more, and maybe in men it's a little bit more, but that basically your frontal brain doesn't grow until you're up to that age. And that's why the insurance companies would always make sure that the rates didn't change until that age.
25.
Yeah, because they basically would keep knowing that these young boys would do stupid things. and that's kind of like the mentality of recognizing
they weren't fully developed. I think it's true for women too.
And I don't have the backing of the science, but there is a correlation to how much fuel you have that keeps your brain constantly in the limbic system. And I think this is where we get into the problem of willpower versus, I'm going to drive myself to not have these cravings, or I'm going to keep myself from this, and you push yourself through pain, and all that kind of keeps coming into our ways of how you're supposed to be strong and push forward, the fortitude that you're supposed to have, right? Perseverance. And that's the same thing as the military. The military has always driven you to go past your cognitive thinking and to just follow suit, right? You're following in the patterns, like everybody's going to follow the leader, and you're going to go into that war and you're just going to do what you're supposed to do. Don't question the leader, right? And it's kind of sad, because it's that mentality that gets us into like, whoa,
It's almost as if every aspect of our life is centered around survival. I mean, if you look at everything, even the food that we eat is survival. I mean, the health foods are survival foods, so, or what's promoted as health. I just, the mentality, just the mindset, just like you said, like, just get through it.
And if you think about like school, right? We just talked about how that slows people down, right? Because you make someone sit still in a classroom when they don't want to, learn something that they're not going to take out into the world. They're going to then have debt. That means they have to go get a job. That means they have to go work to pay off this debt. So it's that whole cycle, comes into really, you could see how there's a system that's, you hate to think that someone's really planned this out, like there's some evil person behind it all. But, Hollywood has taken it to, many movies and many ways of seeing how someone wants to control us, right? And, it's kind of like, you start to wonder, like, really, like, how does all this stuff still stay, like, this way, when you kind of like, when we're
it's easy. It's marketing. That's what it is.
But
I mean,
marketing, like,
it's easy.
As open as we can, right? We're trying to give you as much
Yeah.
information, you know, but it's
Yeah.
like like I said, you only have a small limited viewership based on people being okay with questioning what they've been taught, right?
Yeah.
It takes a while. for people
Well,
to go.
Bernays started that. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that documentary, Century of the Self. If you've never watched that, that's a really good one to watch because it shows you the history of marketing. It's so interesting. And Edward
Oh yeah.
Bernays was the,
Yeah.
the guy who developed basically the marketing strategies that we see today.
Yeah.
And
He was the cousin
it's
of Sigmund
there's
Freud.
not and there's not the most positive motives behind it, and it was used for many malicious kind of things, I think, in some ways. So I think that's probably the easiest way that people get, if you want to use control as the word, controlled and manipulated and motivated into doing certain things. That's probably, if you want to, but then again, like what we're talking about, you have to get yourself out of, you got to get woke, and
Well, there's
you
another,
got to start seeing things differently,
there's another movie I like. It's called Dinner with Andre, and it's literally
Oh, I like that movie too. That's an old one.
conversation- Yeah, a conversation that's between two men, and one is actually talking about the establishment actually encloses himself in their own prison, and the idea of how that is constructed from within, so that it looks like no one's doing anything to you because you're choosing things to box yourself in, and it's an interesting movie if you ever check it out.
Yeah.
Have you seen that movie, Kyle?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'll check it out though.
I'll have to check it out. Okay, well,
We got everything?
anything you want to
Uh,
add? I know we kind of like started on a tangent.
So what I think the solution is to the science problem is to smash the cartel, like how, well, so you can't say that's what you're doing, right? So
Yeah.
consider like Uber, okay? If Uber
You're
had,
really red right now, by the way.
yeah, I'm trying to move the light like to somewhere where
Now it looks
it'll,
like you're in a disco.
That's a little bit better. Yeah.
because
Sorry.
if you bounce it off the wall, it actually changes the wavelength that comes back to light
Yeah.
me, So like,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. So
So it's like Uber, you're saying?
yeah, if Uber had tried to make sure that what they were doing was legal before they did it, it would not have
Yeah.
worked. Okay, so they just did it, and then they had a user base that was very passionate about their service, and then that's where like the kind of realpolitik comes in. Like the politicians would have wanted to shut it down because they're, that they are part of, the cartelized taxi system in these cities is part of the governmental apparatus. So of course they would shut it down if they could, and they've, now they're trying to like regulate it and stuff like that, and just to a certain extent, Uber is kind of playing along, which is not too cool, but because now what they're going to do is they're going to become part of the system, right? They get absorbed in the system, and then they make
Right.
it so the next Uber can't do what Uber did. So it's like you burn the bridge behind you that you crossed over. So that's the unfortunate part. But the fortunate part is the smashing of the cartel in the first place. And I was thinking, I actually had a little bit of email correspondence with Joel Salatin, the
I love
farm-
him. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple years ago when I was finishing my dissertation, I had this idea, and I emailed him, and I was like, I just asked him, I was like, so what if I raised a bunch of money, like on Kickstarter or one of these crowdfunding sites, right?
Uh-huh.
To cover the cost of doing a bunch of experiments. And he just we would set up an experiment where we would like take a bunch of pigs or whatever they were and feed some of them like a bunch of vegetable oil and some of them some other kind of fat, like a saturated fat, and then do some sort of experiment like on their livers and whatever the final assay would be, right? To measure like the different effects of these oils over the life of these pigs. And then and then publish it. So essentially crowdfund science and do it outside of the university like monopoly funding system. And you could get excitement of the entire community, like the paleo community, repeat people, because you'd be like, hey, look, we're going to test, polyunsaturated fats versus like, say, coconut oil in these pigs. And it's like Joel Salatin's farm. He's kind of like famous and people like his farm. You could even have the pigs that like at the end, like their meat be part of the rewards for like supporting, supporting the project or something.
But who's gonna get the vegetable oil one?
If you did that, right. Well, I mean, that wouldn't be, most pork is in the stores that way, but.
I'm playing. But I actually like this idea though. Because
right. So if you did that, other people might imitate that. And once if you can pull that off, I think that kicks out one of the legs of the stool that the system kind of sits on. Like, because part of their justification for existence is this research can't be conducted without our centralized control of it.
Right.
Okay. Allow you to try, and then you fail, and then they go, okay, well, I guess now we have to have total control. They just have the total. They give them the total control and go, if you tried to do it like each on your own, it wouldn't work. Just trust us. Like, we just need this total control. So yeah, if it kind of breaking that idea, because right now that podcast that I was trying to record that someday will be on online. One of the episodes was about the March for Science last year. Do you guys remember that? The March for Science. It was like right after the Women's March.
Okay, so that's probably why we didn't hear about it, because
right.
Yeah, the Women's March was so much press on that,
Yeah, so it was just like it was kind of like the Bill Nye, like Neil deGrasse Tyson type science stuff.
Oh, right.
And those people, to them, to support science is to support the government funding. Like they don't see that those are not the same thing.
Right.
So something really dramatic culturally has to happen to like smash that idea and destabilize the cartelization system, So because the system has proven so resilient to absorb, like it's absorbed, osteopathy, it absorbed like chiropractic, like the system will have these opponents and will first attack them, and then we'll slowly absorb them and regulate them and change them such that they are no longer opponents, but like are just another part of the system, And so anyway, I think that's one way to do it. And another way is those lectures that I wanted to make about like physiology online and try to sever the idea that a medical education can only happen in a college or like a biological education. Because I would like to provide something that would be as educational as like an actual college course, or I mean, actually more so. And I don't think that would be difficult. Like I want to make courses and have them edited in a fun way. And and I have a specific like pedagogical theory that I want to do.
It's about the content and the more so than anything else. And if you have really good content that people can connect to and understand, then I think you don't have to worry as much about the other stuff, because I've seen people who have really great, techniques and fancy video and stuff, and their information is all wrong, and it's just, I mean, I think, and then you have people that like, it doesn't matter how great the video is, they're going to still watch this person because they have a certain charisma about them, or they have really good information, or both, so there's other aspects. Yeah. So don't let that stop you.
Yeah, I just, I guess it's just been like an idea that I've been kicking around for such a long time that it's like, hard to get excited like it's the first day, like oh, it's not a new idea for me anymore. But what I could do is, like how I wanted to make that video about some of the information that we were talking about today with the critical analysis of journal papers and stuff like that. I could try and write like a kind of like a storyboard idea for a video that would be that, and
That's a good idea.
And yeah, you guys could give me feedback on what you thought about it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, I because I want to kind of like give science like a soul, you know? Because like I was saying about like,
I got that feeling from that. Yeah, that's where you're going with it. I think that's great because that's what it's missing. It's so soulless right now, actually, in so many
like people
ways,
that are into like Bill Nye and stuff, and it's like that's so not cool.
No. It's boring. I think that art and science coming together needs to come back and make a comeback, like some kind of a renaissance.
Yeah.
Art and Science 101.
Yeah, we could do that. Maybe Kyle could do that for us. But yeah, that's cool.
Well, thanks for listening.
Yeah, anytime. So thank you, Kyle, for being on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I really, really enjoyed it. And you are welcome back anytime. Do you have anything you want to plug? Anything you want to tell people on how to find you? Or
no, just the same stuff as last time. The website.
Thanks again, Kyle. And hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Send that outline. Let's do this.
Oh, right. The outline. Yeah, I've got
Maya will be
these
sending you an
papers on my
email,
desk.
I guess.
Okay.
All right. What?
I said we can do this.
Yes, we can. We can. It's going to happen. It's just, it's a matter of when.
All right. Well.
All right, guys. Yeah.
Bye.
All right.
Good night.
Bye-bye.